Welcome to Quantum Stellar. This is incredible. This will blow your mind. You gotta hear this. Okay, here we go. Though throughout the late 1800s and the early 1900s, newspapers across America ran story after story of an astonishing phenomenon. The discovery of giant human skeletons from California to Ohio. People claim to have unearthed enormous bones, often measuring upwards of 7 to 9 feet, and these skeletons just appear in rural fields or hidden caves. They were found in places steeped in myth, mystery, and ancient history sparked curiosity and speculation. Across the nation, one of the most famous accounts came from the Grand Canyon, a place already shown in mystery and Native American lore, in 1909 in Arizona. The Gazette reported that an explorer named G. Kincaid, supposedly under the Smith Institution sponsorship, had found a hidden cave system contained not only giant bones, but also relics. Relics that bore a striking resemblance to ancient Egyptian artifacts. The article described underground passages filled with statues, mummies, and hieroglyphic engravings bizarre for a desert landscape thousands of miles from Egypt. Kincaid's account noted that the structures within the cave bore the names and likenesses of Egyptian gods, suggesting that these caves were more than just burial sites. They were temples, possibly belonging to a civilization. Lost to time, the Kincaid discovery became an instant legend, though it quickly vanished from headlines, raising suspicions of a cover-up. Many believe that these findings were suppressed as they posed uncomfortable question about America's ancient past, and come possibly with dominant archaeologue who narratives for those who believe this story. This cover-up wasn't merely academic, it was intentional, meant to conceal a lost history beyond the Grand Canyon. Giant bones were reported worldwide, further fueling the theory that these giants were part of an ancient, sophisticated culture, possibly the mound builders, an enigmatic civilization, left Earth and structures across the Midwest. Though skeptics were quick to dismiss the findings as either misinterpretations or hoaxes, the accounts continued to surface, each adding to the growing legend of America's giants. Some theorize that these artifacts and bones belonged to a lost race of giants whose existence erased was in mainstream historical records for reasons still unknown. The more these stories appeared, the more they began to weave a larger narrative. Were these giants remnants of the Nephilim? The fallen ones mentioned in Genesis 6:3-4 are described as beings of enormous size, and strengthen this biblical connection, provided a spiritual dimension to the mystery as people question whether these giants were the offspring of the sons of God. If so, why had they resurfaced in America, and why was their existence seemingly obscured? To answer this question, I sat down with author and filmmaker Timothy Albrino in order to find out what's really going on. We should be careful with some of the accounts that come out of the newspapers at the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s. There was a lot of embellishment. There was a lot of hyperbole in the papers there. The periodicals were in competition, so they would often publish sensational stories to try and capture the audience. So it was not uncommon to have all kinds of fanciful stories being reported as legitimate news stories. Having said that, there's no way that all of the stories related to the bones of giants that appeared in those periodicals are all false. There's definitely, in my estimation, there's definitely true the idea that the bones of giants were being discovered and in the mounds of America. I think that's the most logical when you look at all the evidence, when you look at Surrey Abraham, actually mentioned as a race, and the bone course of giants that are buried mounds that are buried among the story, or hammer at the abundance of stories, draw you a conclusion in the century to draw something to that effect. And Colonel Powell, who was the director of the Smithsonian Institution, in a correspondence with a colleague of his, was remarking about the bones of giants being discovered in America, and he said that we cannot yet discuss, basically, and this is paraphrasing, we can't discuss this topic of giants until we can determine where they came from, because he was most interested and most concerned with the anthropologic doctrine of isolationism, and that was why he was hesitant to talk about the giants, because according to my research, the giants came from the Middle East, primarily the giants that were in America, the red-haired giants that the Indians talk about, and indeed some of the account of the bones of giants being discovered in the mounds in various parts of America, especially in the Midwest. Of those giants, there was evidence that they had red hair and that they were dressed in some cases, various kinds of armor, and were discovered with artworks that were reminiscent of Middle Eastern artifacts. So Colonel Powell's problem, who's the director of the Smithsonian Institution, his problem was not so much that the bones of giants were being discovered, but apparently they had arrived in the United States from foreign shores, which again contradicted the doctrine of isolationism. There was one particular article that told the story of one Professor Kincaid who discovered Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon, and there's no way to know if that story is true, if it was just a fanciful attempt by the newspaper to regale their readers with this incredible story. So I think that there is something in the Grand Canyon, I'm not sure what it is, but the Grand Canyon is an area that it's very bizarrely guarded. There are parts of it that are off limits, not just because of geological concerns, but there's something else is going on there as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if any of those stories about Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon can be verified or have been verified again. I'm cautious when dealing with those stories that came from the newspapers at the turn of the century, but at the same time I would not discount the notion that you could find Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon. I think that the ancients, we were traveling and crossing the oceans much earlier than we think, I would say. Undoubtedly, the Phoenicians were, and it wouldn't surprise me if the Egyptians were, but undoubtedly the Phoenicians, so I would expect to find Phoenician artifacts. And indeed, I believe Phoenician artifacts have been found in America, in my opinion. This is the telltale sign of being a Tet was a sacrificial altar of the Phoenician people. This bowl was about the same size as an infant child would be, so you think this was used for ritual sacrifice of babies. I think it's indicative of sacrifice on the banks of the Chicago River thousands of years ago. There were sites where you had a Phoenician or Proto-Phoenician script, for example, that have been discovered at American Stonehenge. Maruli discovered this. Well, he highlighted this in one of his films, that there were Phoenicians, some sort of Phoenician or Proto-Phoenician script discovered at that site. And if that's true, and I believe it is, then that is definitely evidence that the Phoenicians were here in the ancient past. And if the Phoenicians could make it, then it's also possible that the Egyptians as well, the Phoenicians, were the better. Mariners were in fact the builders, the boat builders for the Egyptian fleet, and they were the master mariners. The Phoenicians could have had all kinds of artifacts that they carried with them because they were traders, so they would stop at all the major ports on their journeys, engage in trade. And among the Phoenicians, I believe that among the regularized Phoenicians were giants and individuals of extraordinary stature. The Phoenicians certainly had a cult of giant worship, and I believe that they had some descendants of the Nephilim or the Anakim among them, because they were essentially Canaanites, and indeed the Greeks called the Canaanites Phoenician. That's where we get the term. So the Phoenicians were obviously seafaring people, and we know that the Philistines were seafaring people. there could be some crossover there. And the Philistines, among the Philistines was Goliath of Gath, the most famous giant in the Bible, who David slew. And so there's ample evidence that there were giants among the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians traveling all around the world were, in a sense, depositing these descendants of the Nephilim on different continents, including North America. I believe that the key to understanding the dispersion of the Nephilim all across the earth is the Phoenicians definitely had a very prominent presence on the island of Sardinia. And in fact, I would say that even in a more Canaanitish proto-Phoenician culture inhabited Sardinia first, and among this culture were people of extraordinary stature. Johnson and others have investigated. Some investigators in Inez and early 1800s drew the same conclusion, that there are many indications inhabited the island of Sardinia. You know, Sardinia, I myself conducted 2 separate investigations on the island, interviewed multiple witnesses, mostly elderly people who were living and who grew up during a time when the government was still concealing the bones of giants. Not just concealing them. When I say the government, I mean the provincial government in Sardinia, and also the University of C in the capital city of K in Sardinia seems to have been involved in not only covering up and concealing the existence of giants, but confiscating the relics, the artifacts, the bones of giants on the island of Sardinia. And these witnesses were not conveying to me that they were telling me stories about digging up the bones and bodies of giants themselves. And these are not, lest anyone think that these people are confusing these bones with giant sloths, mammoths, or dinosaurs. The reason why this was so popular in Sardinia, that the stories of people digging up the bones of giants, were because people were actively looking for the bones of giants, because oftentimes bracelets and necklaces and these gigantic individual, these rings on the deceased rings of individuals. And so people were obviously wanting to, it was sort of, they were treasure hunting. They wanted to harvest the valuables from these bodies because they were so often associated with riches, with various kinds of ornaments, even earrings, and obviously mammoths. And giant sloths and dinosaurs were not habitually wearing jewelry. And I interviewed dozens of people who discovered the bodies of giants. It's in different circumstances. Some people were just plowing in their field. Others were digging the foundations of their basements. Others were officially employed by the government to dig up artifacts related to the neurological civilization, the ancient Nagic civilization, and working around the Nagitos. And we're in the course of excavating some of these sites. We're discovering entire skeletons of giants, and we're talking anywhere from 7 and 112 to 20 feet tall. So we're not just talking about, 6 and 1 key 2 tall people in the S, and most of the accounts were much larger than 17. Most of the accounts were 8, 9, 10 giants, all the way up to 15, and they were explicit. The stories are that there's just way too many eyewitness accounts, and way too many people who have held the bones of giants in their hands, way too many people who have open sarcophagi of giants in Sardinia to discount this as mere fables of folklore. And again, I interviewed individuals who took the ring off of the fingers, the gigantic rings off of the gigantic fingers. And then later on, when the discovery came to individuals or agents from the government or from the university, would show up to their house and forcibly confiscate all of the artifacts. So this was happening. By the way, this was happening in the early 20th century on the island of Sardinia, so all the way through the teens and the 30s and the 30s and the 40s, even up into the 50s in Sardinia, people were routinely the skeletal remains of gigantic humanoids. So if you interview especially the elderly people in Sardinia, you will discover that many of them all remember when the bones of giants were being routinely discovered and confiscated, but some of them will tell you stories of their own encounters with such artifacts. And again, I interviewed a handful of these individuals who were in the employ of the government to excavate the relics of the Nuragic civilization, and among those relics were the skeletal remains of giants, most likely Canaanitish giants, the Rem. We're talking about the descendants of the air music. We know that the land canon was littered with clans of giants, especially in the hill country. There were the sons of the Anakim, who were themselves the descendants of the Nephilim, the Zamzumimim, various tribes and clans of giants inhabiting the hill country in Canaan. And these were the most formidable enemies that Joshua and the Israelites had to contend with in order to subdue the land, to conquer the land of Canaan. So who knows how long these Canaanitish tribes, these giants, were inhabiting Canaan before the conquest. It could have been for thousands of years, could have been for hundreds of years, but certainly this seems to have been the land of Canaan, seems to have been a veritable minefield of the descendants of the Nephilim after the flood. They consolidated in this region, and now perhaps it wasn't exclusively in the land of Canaan that these giant clans had settled, maybe all over the Mediterranean, but certainly the land of Canaan was perhaps ground zero for the post-flood giants, the offspring of the Nephilim. And I would say that the land of Canaan and Sardinia, because Sardinia certainly appears to be one of the primary settlements of the descendants of the Neph in the post-Alien age. I think that the giants, certainly there was a mandate from Haven, according to the Bible, to extinguish, to annihilate the offspring of the Nephilim. This is, of course, a famous genocide that happened in Canada during the conquest. And what most people don't realize is that those clans, the ones that God wanted the Hebrews to utterly annihilate, were in fact, the descendants of the Nephilim were the clans that were intermingled with the Anakim and the offspring of what was left of the offspring of the Watchers in the posted world. So there's a reason why this genocide was directed at these clans in the hill country, precisely because they were the remnants of the hybrid species that are inhabiting the earth still, or inhabiting the aftermath of the flood. And isn't it interesting the way Hollywood is beating this drum about the return of the Titans, Thanos the Mad Titan, Sam Worthington, who was in Clash of the Titans and Wrath of the Titans, starred in a movie last year, straight to Netflix, called The Titan, and the new Godzilla movie, where they have rebranded them. They're no longer Moas, which is what monsters of unusual size, or whatever, they rebranded them as the Titans, the original and rightful rulers, because, again, presenting them as Titans, the original and rightful rulers of the earth. The Titans are still around. In fact, I argue in my book Last Clash of the Titans that they are somehow still influencing things on this, even though they are currently chained in the abyss. Revelation 9 says they're going to get out for 5.5 months at the end when the Nephilim returned, and we understand that the Nephilim, the spirits of the Nephilim that were destroyed in the days of Noah in the flood, were barred entrance in the afterlife into the nether world, into heaven, basically condemned to roam the earth. That was the belief of the early church. That was the belief of the Jews in the time of Jesus and through all the Old Testament period. It wasn't until Augustine in about the 5th century that belief went away. Also basically turned the church away from believing that the Nephilim had been created at all. Ezekiel, though, saw it. And this is the thing, God bless people like Ray Marzoli, who's been, teaching this for a long time. He's right. The Nephilim are returning. But I think Ezekiel 39 is a clue, but you gotta understand the worldview of the prophets, understand what Ezekiel was writing in Ezekiel 39. He's writing about the culmination of the War of Gog, and Emoji and Gog were the Old Testament Antichrist figures. Okay, he is the figure that John in the book of Revelation calls the Antichrist. That is the same war that culminates with the Battle of Armageddon, which is fought for the Harmot of God's Mount of Assembly, which is Zion, the Temple Mountain in Jerusalem, Ezekiel says. God said that. He will prepare a place in Israel for the burial of Mok. The forces of Mok, the Valley of the Travelers, east of the sea, refers to east of the Dead Sea, and it will block the travelers. The key is understanding that travelers in the Old Testament concept world were spirits that would travel or cross over from one plane of existence to another. In other words, the realm of the dead to the land of the living, and the places where he identifies east of the dead are places that during the Exodus, the stations of the Exodus refer to a couple of places that are named for these interactions with the spirit realm of the stops in the Exodus. One of the stations of the Exodus is called O, which means spirits of the dead. It's based on a root word O, which means medium, the medium of Endor that Saul went to see was the O of Endor. In fact, one of the giants killed by David's men, Ishi. They condense the word Ishbenab is how it looks to us in English, Ishben, Ish, son of the necromancer, son of the medium, and he was of the descendants of the Rapha. The sons of the Reem were these spirits that the Amorites, Canaanites believed were the spirits of the mighty men who were of old, the ancestors of their kings. They were called in Canaanite texts, called by scholars the Rem texts. It's written about the time of the judges. These respondents were summoned through necromancy rituals to the tabernacle of El Mount Hermon, where El, they believed, would speak words of revocation to resurrect these spirits that were called warriors of Baal. And in these texts, they're described as warriors. They mount their chariots, and they travel first one day, and then another, and at dawn of the third day, they arrive to be resurrected like Jesus, who went down and preached and proclaimed to the spirits, sin and prison until dawn the third day when he arrived, except that he really was resurrected. And Ezekiel in Ezekiel 39 says this is where these travelers will be buried, another one of the stops on the mountain. In fact, the mountain where Moses was led by God to get his only view of the Holy Land, the Promised Land, and climb this mountain of the Aim in Hebrew, which means Traveler's Mount. Nebo is the mountain of the travelers. It's right there across from Richo and the plains of Mo, and that's where this demonic army will fall now. I believe that the Nephilim will return, and I believe they're going to be the demons who possess a human army. I think by this point the restrainer will have been removed. The church will be removed. So I pray I'm right that we won't be here for that day, because that's the day of Armageddon. And when this demonic army comes against Jerusalem to try to claim God's Mount of Assembly, just like Lucifer in Isaiah 14, I will establish my Mount Assembly on Mount Zaphon and raise himself above the stars. Angels of God on that day when God personally takes the battlefield, which Ezekiel describes how the travelers will be destroyed. And interestingly, in that verse in Ezekiel 39, he says, then the world will know I am the Holy One in Israel. That phrase is similar to one that we see in the Old Testament many times, the Holy One of Israel. Ezekiel 39, after he destroys the Antichrist army in the war of the Battle of Armageddon, then the war of Gog and Magog, he becomes the Holy One in Israel because he's on the battlefield. So yes, that is what I mean. The Nephilim have always been here. If they're the spirits of those who died in the flood, they've always been with us. Because demons have always been with us. But on that day, they will be inhabiting the bodies of the I believe this army. that comes against Israel, it will literally be an army of the evil dead. So there was this campaign of extermination against the giants that is evident in the Old Testament. David, of course, and his mighty men were contending with the offspring, with remnants of the giants, existed in the neck of the woods in Canaan, in the Levant, but I think it also, the giants probably breed out over time, and like that genetic material, that genetic markers of the giants were breed out into the popular time, so you would have successive giants, the ring, become the, have a vein, this Miller was being mixed into the gene pool, and they're due in smalling, or dimensions, more successive generations that were known becomes, or becoming more, that particularly individuals of extraordinary stature, gigantic, in other words 9, 10, 11, 12 t tall. So just the natural process of interbreeding with regular size humans, beings would wash out that gene pool, and would disseminate the genes of the giants through the general population. And so in that way the giants would have gradually disappeared unless you had an area on Earth where the genes of the giants could be conserved and there was a big enough population of giants to where they could interbreed and in that way preserve those genetic markers. Otherwise they would have intermingled with the local populaces and gradually reduced in stature over time. So, as I said, successive generations would have had less. And of those genetic markers present in their genomes, which I think is what happened in the United States here, in North America rather, whereas at one time you had the giants who were living among the native people precisely because the Phoenicians had brought them over. I believe the Phoenicians were mining copper in the Great Lakes, and they established. The Phoenicians were in the habit of establishing colonies wherever they went, and they were friendly colonies. The Phoenicians, their goal was to establish trade, and these colonies would intermingle with the populaces, and then they would create permanent trading posts, so they would not be hostile in most cases to the local populations. They would want to integrate with them for the purpose of trade. And so if there were giants among the Phoenicians, these giants would have also integrated with the local populations, i.e. the Native American tribes, and so you would have had essentially Native American giants after that. Integration took place, and successive generations were born. So I think that's why you find the bones of giants in the mounds, in the Indian mounds. And in the beginning, those giants would have probably been fair-skinned, red-haired, or blonde-haired humanoids. But after enough interbreeding, they would have looked more and more like Native Americans, right? So you would have a very interesting situation in which the genetic markers of the Nephilim were introduced in North America through the Phoenicians interbreeding with the Native Americans. And that's not to say that the giants themselves are peaceful. The Native Americans, they tell stories, the ferocity of the giants. Everyone's familiar with Lovelock Cave, and the fact that the Indians there wanted to eliminate the red-haired giants inhabiting the cave precisely because that they were hostile. They were aggressive, and they effectively destroyed that clan of giants by trapping them in that cave and killing them with smoke and fire. So the giants had a predisposition to violence, hostility. There are even Native American legends that talk about the cannibalistic giants, that they were cannibals. So I'm not trying to say that all of the giants were integrating with the native populace. Some of them certainly were, while others were probably just remaining hostile and feeding on the native populace, forcibly taking their women and attempting to copulate with them, perhaps to some varying success, of course, depending how large the giants were. So there's all kinds of scenarios in which we can envision the giants dispersing across the earth from ground zero, which would have been Canaan and Sardinia and the islands in the Mediterranean. I think generally speaking, if they're out of Canaan during the conquest, then they've got to find other places to live, and if they're being primarily disseminated through a seafaring people, namely the Phoenicians, then it sort of makes sense that you find the giants all over the earth, because they were distributed all over the earth through the trade activity of the Phoenicians. And I am absolutely unequivocally convinced that the Phoenicians were mining copper in the Great Lakes. We know it's a historical fact that the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa. They were the first to do so, but I believe they were crossing the seas. They had remarkable boats. The Phoenicians divided their boats in such a way that they could be disassembled and then reassembled very quickly, so almost like linking logs or something like this. The Phoenicians could arrive to the shores of a distant continent. They could disassemble their boats, carry the planks throughest over the landscape, and then reassemble the boats in the rivers and the waterways. And if we think about it in terms of North America, they could have arrived at the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They could have taken their boats as far as they get down the water wave. When they encountered an impediment such as Niagara Falls, they could disassemble their boats, carry the planks overland, and reassemble the boats in the waterways, and make their way to the Great Lakes, right? And so the Phoenicians were remarkable boat builders. They were remarkable craftsmen. In fact, I believe that the Phoenicians were the only flood culture that could still build megaliths, and they did so on the island of Sardinia, although not to the same grandeur as the antediluvian civilizations, but yet they held the knowledge they vouched for. Save the knowledge, they were the keepers of secret knowledge. Indeed, the Phoenicians were in effect a secret society, and modern masonry, Freemasonry, is derived from the mysteries of the Phoenicians, who is Hayam Af, who was basically the founder of the Masonic order. Masons will say maybe that Solomon, or perhaps even go all the way back to Tubal-Cain, or maybe perhaps Nim as the founder of their society, fraternity. But if you look at the lore of the Masons, you're going to discover that Hayam Af is really regarded as the founder, and Hayam Af, according to legend, was hired by Solomon to help them build the temple. Indeed, it was King Hayam who was hired, who was a good friend of Solomon, who Solomon employed, and all of Ham's king Hayam artisans to build the temple with Hayam. We're talking about the king of Sidon, and Tai said that he was a Phoenician king, so Hayam was the king of the Phoenicians, and these were the master masons, these were the master artisans of the ancient world, and they were the master mariners, and they were the alphabetical system is the foundation of our own. That's why we call it the phonics, because it comes from Phoenician, because it was the Phoenicians who created the alphabetic system that we use today, the base of it, the foundation of it, which we've elaborated on the Greeks and the Romans and so on. Fourth, we've all elaborated on that system. But the Phoenicians were remarkable, and there's very little known about the Phoenicians, even though they were probably the most remarkable ancient civilization in regard to their great knowledge, even more so than the Egyptians as it pertains to their ability in masonry and boat making and so forth. Remember, it was the Siddars of Lebanon, the planks that were used in the great temples in the Levant and in the Fertile, the Crescent in Egypt, the wooden planks of their temples and their great boats, all of their everything that was made, I shouldn't say everything, much of what was made out of wood for the royal palaces, and the great temples came from Lebanon, from the Siddars of Lebanon, and those Siddars were delivered by the Phoenicians and worked by the Phoenicians. The master craftsmen, the master masons, the master mariners were the master navigators of the ancient world. So I believe that the Phoenicians were harboring secret knowledge, that they somehow were able to conserve that wazir, either given to them or they discovered from the pre-Phil world. I don't think that the Phoenicians brought the language from the pre-flood world. I think that they were a secret society. The whole civilization was like a secret society. Very little is known about it today, but they were essential if you want to understand the ancient world truly. Understand it, especially in regard to trade. Then you have to be familiar with the Phoenicians. You have to familiarize yourself with the Phoenicians, because we are coming in and out of all these different cultures all the time. Everyone's talking about them. The Greeks were talking about them. The ancient Egyptians were talking about them. Persians were interacting with them. Everybody was interacting with the Phoenicians. And of course the Hebrews were interacting with the Phoenicians, sometimes on very friendly terms like Solomon and King Haim of Ty, and sometimes there was hostility, but the Phoenicians are always an important element of what's happening in the ancient world, and yet we know almost nothing about them. We know a whole lot about the ancient Egyptians, we know a whole lot about the other Mesopotamian civilizations, and the ancient Greeks, and so forth, but we know very little, almost nothing about the Phoenicians. Of course, the most famous, the Phoenician that everyone was from with that they don't realize is Hannibal Barca, who was the greatest enemy that Rome had ever seen. The greatest enemy with whom Rome had ever contended was Hannibal. And where was he from? Carthage. Carthage was in North Africa, and Carthage was a Phoenician settlement. They were Phoenician, and the Romans were appalled by the Phoenicians precisely because the Phoenicians were in the habit of sacrificing their children to idols, to Baal, and the other Phoenician gods, and they would sacrifice their children the most heinous way, and the Romans were incensed by this. This is one of the reasons why the Romans hated the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians came very close to destroying Rome through Hannibal. These were remarkable people, and almost nothing is known of them, even though they were, in my estimation, sailing their remarkable ships to the shores of many different continents. I get the sense, and I know this is conspiratorial, but I get the sense that there's somewhat of a conspiracy revolving around the Phoenicians. I think the Phoenicians were in possession of knowledge and artifacts that would, to some extent, should they come to light, rewrite history, artifacts from the antediluvian world. And part of those artifacts would be the genetic stock of the Nephilim, the descendants of the Nephilim, who were certainly in their midst. Mount Hermon has always been considered, and by these ancient Near Eastern cultures, and even by the Romans, and to be, we would call to today, an axis money gather another Rome, or perhaps a portal to somewhere else. And Greeks to be other perhaps, right? This is a cosmic mountain. This is the way the Mesopotamians would have viewed Mount Hermon. It's a cosmic mountain. And so it was beat that there was a gate there to the other world, and part of this tale revolves around the Enochian tale. And I say part of it because the Greeks, their own reasons for believing that, and the Canaanites had their own reasons for believing it, but obviously the Hebrews believe, because of the Anakim tale, that the Watchers descended here. It's not coincidental that it was upon the slopes of Hermon that Jesus transfigured before his disciples, and it's not coincidental that it was at the base of Hermon where he declared that the gates of hell would not prevail against this church. And he did this specifically at the site of the Grotto of Pan, which was thought to be an entrance into the netherworld or the underworld. So Mount Hermon is a cosmic mountain in the chronology of the Mesopotamians. In the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, is a cosmic mountain. And again, what if that means something like a portal or a gate to hell, or an axis mundi, whatever that means, was viewed as this place where heaven and earth and the underworld were connected. That's what's known as an axis mundi. First enunciates an incredible story, a remarkable tale, and it turns out that this story lays the foundation for some of the most enigmatic references in the Old and New Testament of the Bible. So this isn't just some fanciful fiction that they're chilled there at nighttime. Some of first stories to ancient Altahina from where you can ta you may move the in Hebrew cosmos smology chino cosmology story Bruce told there a story childer some bedtime stinakis. That's how foundational it is. And the story involves a company of 200 angels, who the Book of Enoch denominates watchers, and these angels were observing the daughters of men. And of course the reference in Genesis 6, they were observing the daughters of men. They saw that they were comely, that they were fair, that they were beautiful, and they desired to take them as wives. In fact, their desire, there's two explicit things they desire. Two things that are conspicuous and one thing that is inconspicuous. Two things that are directly mentioned and the final motivation is inferred. So there's three motivations here. So the first thing we have to understand about the story of the Watchers is that there are three motivating factors that led to this transgression, which forms the beginning of the narrative, the historical narrative in the Book of Enoch. And the first motivation is the Watchers' desire to marry and copulate with the daughters of men. So they desire to wed these women and impregnate them. The second desire was to progenerate through them their own offspring. They wanted to procreate and have children with their wives, with their human wives. That's the second motivation, and the first two are implicit. The third one is inferred. So the first two motivations in the text and the narrative of First Enoch. The third is this third motivation that I'm going to explain is inferred in what happens. And the third motivation is they want to usurp dominion of the earth from the sons of Adam through the age of their hybrid offspring. That's the third motivation, and that is, as I said, not implicit, and the text is infirm. So the Watchers, with these desires in mind, concocted this plan that they were going to descend to the earth in direct defiance of God. They knew that what they were about to do amounted to a grave transgression, and so what they did before they implemented this plan, they bound themselves by an oath, and the Book of Enoch says that they bound themselves by mutual imprecations, which means we're all in this together. We're binding ourselves together so that we will all have to pay the penalty for this great sin. So they bind themselves by mutual implications, and then they descend to the earth, and the point of arrival happens to be the summit of Mount Hermon, and Mount Hermon is in the Lebanese mountain range, the Lebanon mountain range, and it is one of the highest peaks, and the Watchers descend to Hermon. It is not clear if they bind themselves by the oath before or after. I think they bind themselves by the oath actually when they arrive, because Mammon was for a herever after, known as the Mountain of Oath, so probably they bind themselves with an oath after they descend to Hermon. And as I said before, I do not envision the Watchers flapping their wings, with descending, alighting under the summit of Hermon with these big, bird wings. I think that they arrived at the helmets of advanced aerospace vehicles, in other words, UFOs. So once they bind themselves by this oath, they descend into the plains, and they begin to choose from among the daughters of men suitable wives, each one CH, a singular wife. And the sense isn't that they were invading the villages and throwing these women over their shoulders. This is not what's being communicated, but rather the way I envision it. I think the way it's implied in the text is that the Watchers were covertly observing the witch villages and choosing each one of them from various wives, And then a transaction occurs. A train that's villages that they might just, and this is not exactly implicit in the text, is also inferred in the text that the watchers engage in a transaction with the fathers of the maidens that they want to win. Remember, the motivation here is not just to copulate women, rather there's been to procreate offspring, to have families in the manner than the states of Adam, where is widened with these women. And remember, motivation. And so the watchers, once they have the maidens that they desire to marry, they go to their fathers and they make a transaction. And the transaction is something like, again, this is inferred in the text. The transaction is something like, I desire to marry your daughter, and here's what I'm going to give you as a doll, as payment in exchange for your daughter's hand in marriage. And this is all being done in accordance with the customs of the ancient Near East. So the watchers are engaging in the cultural norms here, revolving around marriage, revolving around the covenant of marriage, and those norms involve something like $1 as a payment for the daughter's hand in marriage. And this is a patriarchal society, so the fathers had the authority to give their daughters hands in marriage. The women really didn't have a say, although I do believe that the women were willing participants because they're later on judged for their transgression with the watchers. So it's not that the watchers are forcibly taking these women and demanding the fathers give them their hands in marriage. Rather, there's a transaction happening. Here's a bargain. And it turns out it's a fianti bargain, because in exchange for their daughter's hands in marriage, the watchers teach the sons of Adam. They teach the men, they instruct them in the knowledge the men were already striving to learn. And what that is, that informs us that the watchers already knew what kind of knowledge these men wanted. So they already came to the table with a bargaining chip in mind. You want to know X, Y, and Z, we can teach you these things, and in exchange, you give us your daughter's hands in marriage. So it's a transaction, and this is important because it's a legal transaction that the watchers are after. This is a legal transaction with the rightful regents of the earth. It's the son of Adam, and so the watchers are obviously trying to accomplish something with legal. Otherwise, they would just have taken these women by force. They did not. They wed them, and you can envision the watchers, and of course the watchers are going to be received as the gods. The gods have descended, F, and you can imagine being the father of one of these maidens. X, this transcendent being. One of the gods wants to marry my daughter and is going to give me as a dowry, is going to instruct me in the secrets of heaven. So it was a very favorable transaction for the sons of Adam, and again, I think specifically the sons of Cain, but that's just my hunch. Let's say so. As the story goes, the watchers with the daughters of men. We can imagine that this happened with all the pomp and ceremony, and the circumstance that such a wedding would have elicited the gods are marrying. These women are right 200 watchers, so this is probably a really big celebration, and then the watchers begin to teach men the secrets and the knowledge they were striving to learn in the meantime. And as this is happening, the watchers copulate with wives, become pregnant, conceive, and they give birth to giants. Some ancient texts suggest that some of the women's wombs were split open during birth, or were split open by the enormous size of the babies that are growing in their wombs. But I don't think that's really historically accurate, and as much this is a historical narrative, because the women are later turned into sirens. They're later judged. So I think that most of them and the watchers instruct their wives in the secrets, in these forbidden secrets. So the women are participating in the iniquity of the watchers. They're not just giving birth and dying apparently according to the narrative. So I think that the women were giving birth to normal sized babies, just like babies that are born with gigantism, and those babies, as they progress into toddlers and then into adolescence, experienced an accelerated rate of growth again, just like babies who are born with gigantism. They're born at a normal size and rate, but it's like the valve is never shut off, that the growth spurt never stops. They just keep going and going and going. But in the case of gigantism, it results in very large but weak human beings who have dysfunctional organs and who are usually not very athletic. Andre, the giant, was an exception, and even he died young, the wrestler. People at gigantism do not live very long, in contrast to the offspring of the Watchers, who were superhumanly enhanced with the DNA of their angelic fathers. And so these would have been superheroes, basically hybrids. They would have been human enough to appropriate this authority and dominion of the sons of Adam on earth as given by God, that mandate. But yet at the same time they were infused with the remarkable genetic markers and capabilities of their angelic fathers, and they grew to great stature. According to the Book of Enoch, they began to consume all of the acquisitions of the land and other. They were eating all the food, and humans, beings, were forced to feed the giants according to Enoch, and when they could no longer sustain them, their appetites, the giants began to feed on men. And as all of this is unfolding, mankind is, through the knowledge of the Watchers, they're developing various kinds of technology, including implements of war. Specifically, the Watcher Acel taught men how to forge weapons and make armaments of war, and this is proliferating all kinds of bloodshed on the earth. So there's murderous bloodlust that is induced to the knowledge of the Watchers that had not previously existed in the world. So the Watchers, the knowledge is corrupting mankind, and they're becoming murderous and bloodthirsty and are becoming very idolatrous and altogether wicked, so that by the time the flood comes, their thoughts are only evil continually, as the Bible says. And so eventually there's so much chaos and heaven, death, and war unfolding in the earth that men began to cry out to God to petition heaven, and their petitions are brought before the King of Heaven. The angels bring their petitions to the King of Heaven, and it is decided that the good Watchers, by the way this divine council is apparent first Enoch, because you have the good Watchers in heaven, and you have the apostate Watchers on earth, the defected Watchers on earth, and you have the good ones in heaven, and these are the good ones referred to as the Holy Watchers of Heaven. This terminology, Holy Watcher, is also apparent in the book of Daniel, and so this is effectively members of the Divine Council. This is the council of the King, and the prayers of the petitions of people who are dying and suffering on earth, who are living in this nightmarish dystopia on planet Earth. Their petitions are coming, and before this council, before the King, and the King decides, the King and his council decide that they're going to put a stop to the activity of the Watchers on earth. And what happens is this judgment, this very punitive judgment comes forth, in which the Watchers are to be bound in chains, and their offspring are going to be destroyed before a cataclysm destroys the earth. And so the Watchers are bound in chains. God dispatches some of the good guys to come and bind them in chains, but before they're imprisoned in what Peter calls Tartarus in 2 Peter in the New Testament, directly referencing this story from 1st Enoch, before they're bound in chains in the abyss and Tartarus, they're forced to behold the annihilation and destruction of their beloved sons. And so they have to watch as God incites the offspring of the Watchers into fratricide, into a civil war, a hybrid civil war, in which they utterly annihilate each other. And this is part of the judgment of the Watchers. They have to watch their offspring, the Nephilim, the giants, go to war with one another. And I don't envision this, as you know. BIM giants clunking each other over the heads with clubs. This is a technological war. They're bringing into this conflict all of the technology and knowledge of their fathers of the Watchers. This is what they're bringing into this battle with the armaments forged from the knowledge of the Watchers. So I envision this much more like the ancient Sanskrit epics of India, in which you have these epic battles in which the gods and mortal men are locked in these bloody conflicts, and in the midst of these wars, you have these amazing advanced airspace vehicles being deployed, which are called Banas in the Sanskrit epics. And these Vimanas are like warships, flying-ups that are able to discharge what appears to be some sort of laser or missile, and it's all described in lurid detail in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata ban. And I think this is probably what this conflict between the offspring of the Watchers, this is the hybrid civil war that's unfolding between the various factions of giants on Earth. It looked like a superhuman giants and their advanced technology fighting each other, but in the midst of this battle are also human beings who are also fighting on one side or the other, just like the Sanskrit epics, right? So something like that, in my estimation, is unfolding in this Friday caudal conflict that's unfolding on planet Earth before the flood. And so the Watchers are witnessing their offspring kill each other, and this all happens as prelude to the cataclysm of the flood, which is never actually described in the book, but it's coming in the background. You know it's coming, but it's never actually described in the historical narrative, but that's pretty much what brings the narrative to an end. God chooses to preserve the line of Adam through Noah and some of the animal life on Earth, and everything else is air, applause, destroyed according to the Book of Enoch. The Watchers descended in the days of Jared, and they remained on the earth, or from Jared to the flood of Noah. And depending how you calculate that, according to the Septon, you have something like 12 and 50 years. That's if you interpret that genealogy in a linear way as a linear calculation of time. It's over 1,000 years from Jared to the flood. So that's over 1,000 years, and the Watchers had to intermingle with the human species, and that their offspring had to propagate. And the I said, remember, see you. The third and after the motivation there be the item to claim that bring on a human to me, and it was to bring who made through agency was to bring an offspring, and when I condemn see you bill kingdom and see it through undama mir. And so the Watchers were basically, the idea was to rule, to govern the earth from behind the thrones of their hybrid sons who would become the kings. And indeed they did become the kings, and this is inferred. But what else can you call it if the Watchers, if the giants are consuming all of the acquisitions of the land? In other words, everything is being brought to the G-sense. They're effectively dominating the human race. They're dominating the human populaces. And I think that is in you an intimation, an allusion to the fact they are actually ruling over the kingdoms of men, and indeed establishing their own kingdoms. And I believe the Watchers did exactly what Plato says. The gods then did the gods of the Greek pantheon, Plato says, in the Dialogue, in the Cryas dialogue. Rather, Plato says that the gods allotted, they portioned the earth amongst themselves. It's the first thing they did. And we know that Poseidon took for his allotment Atlantis, the area of the region of Atlantis, and he established his kingdom. And then what does Poseidon do after he's allotted his portion? And then he establishes his kingdom. And then what does he do? He marries a human woman. Plato, he copulates with her, and she gives birth to 10 hybrid sons who become the 10, and they're twins. So 5 sets of twins become the 10 kings of Atlantis, and I think they were giants. And if we're to take that story literally, I think at the very least that story is an allegory of the antediluvian world. And so I think the Watchers did the very same thing they allotted the earth among and themselves. And they established what I call the Empire of the Gods, because effectively an empire, and each of these Watchers, their hybrid sons would have been the kings of their respective realm, and this might have gone all over the world. And so you would have had, in my estimation, you would have had the gods walking among men, the Watchers who were venerated as such as gods, and temples were raised to them, and rather than them being just some ideal to them, they would actually be sitting there receiving the adulation of their human subjects in these temples, and their sons, their hybrid sons, would be the kings literally governing over the kingdoms. And I think we could expect that these would have been quite advanced. At least the knowledge that the Watchers had, extraterrestrial advanced knowledge, would have been deployed and employed in their kingdoms. But not to the commoner. I think that the common people would have been something like a Bronze Age civilization, and that fraternity of hybrid giants would have had advanced knowledge and technology, much like the movie Stargate, in which you have this advanced alien being who is masquerading as the god Amon-Ra with advanced technology, and his guards have these advanced flying machines, aerospace vehicles, advanced staffs that shoot out projectiles. But the rest of the populace is like a Bronze Age Egyptian populace. I think something like that is an accurate view of the antediluvian world. So you have this fraternity of hybrid giants in possession of advanced technology and knowledge, but only them and their moms and their fathers, right? So this is what I call the Empire of the Gods. And you can imagine when those kingdoms go to war, what that would look like, maybe even atomic level armaments like nuclear type technology. But those types of weapons were employed and wrought great destruction on the earth. And maybe this is why, by the way, why do we not find evidence of these advanced civilizations? Because they annihilated themselves so much. Evidence would you find of our civilization in 10,000 years from now if we had utterly annihilated ourselves with nuclear missiles? What kind of evidence would remain if we experienced nuclear holocaust? And I'm not saying a bomb drops here and there. I'm saying every single major city is obliterated, right? CU, that's the kind of war I think was happening then. And then a global cataclysm washes all the debris away in the aftermath, and much of what happens here to the matter, to the material, to the structures, buildings, the edifices are vaporized. They're melted explosive devices that we can't eat, even the destruction of which is beyond our imagination right now. Many times more like an antimatter bomb, is many times more destructive than a nuclear warhead decimating, annihilating, vaporizing these kingdoms, these hybrid kingdoms, these kingdoms that are being governed by the offspring of the Watchers, the Nephilim kingdoms, are being vaporized in a technological war using unimaginably destructive technologies, and then unimaginably destructive cataclysm ensues in the aftermath. Much of that civilization should you expect to find 10,000 years later? The answer was almost nothing. That's the answer. Almost nothing would be the answer. So I think that would be one reason we don't find much evidence of an advanced ancient civilization, is because literally obliterated themselves, right? And I believe that the catalyst, specific catalyst that resulted in my estimation, I could be wrong about this in my opinion, is what is known as the Younger Dry Impact event. And basically the Younger Dry Impact event happened at the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago roughly, and it resulted from fragments of a comet breaking up in the atmosphere or in orbit around the Earth and pummeling the North American ice sheets, the Laurentide ice sheet North America, for example. which covered most of North America at the end of the last ice age, was a mile to a couple miles deep in certain areas. And this is ice. This is solid ice. This is water. Fresh water in the form of ice. And when those fragments of this comet impact, each one of them itself many times more explosive in destruction than an atomic bomb, and so it generates it, vaporizes the demons, but actual giants still roaming the earth after the flood. That's the question that everybody wonders, and the answer to that question depends on how you view for one thing, there are several theories. The Bible is not explicitly about this situation about how we have post-fledged Nephilim in the world. It doesn't explicitly tell us. So I think we have some guesses and some logical inferences. As I said, it all depends on how you view the flood. There are 3 ways you can view the flood of Noah, and contrary to popular belief, all 3 are plausible within the biblical text. In other words, all 3 can be argued the text from the text, just the text. In Genesis, the first view is the most common, the most popular, which is a global flood. When I say global flood, what I mean is every square inch of land on planet Earth is underwater. That means the top of Mount Everest is underwater. That's the global flood. That's the one that most Christians are familiar as the biblical interpretation. The second, the flood position, is what's known as a local flood, and the local flood theory is that there was a catastrophic that was localized to the Fertile Crescent area that Eider as a Batamli Eider to Mesoleral the Mountain Flores to the Osaplio, Enocal region meal to the Bimori, to those of Passat, they flood but proposes that they could see Yuri and Maywood. A priori is that is the local flood theory. The third, a proposition, is one that I think I've invented. I've never heard anyone else propose it. So, but it's a middle ground between those two, between the 2 former theories, and I call this a global cataclysm, a flood that resulted, or rather, a flood that was a cataclysm in which there was catastrophic flooding all over the earth, but not necessarily covering every square inch of water, and not just localized to one region of the earth. So that would be sort of in between the global flood and the local flood again, what I call a global cataclysm. And I say cataclysm because in my view, a flood in this particular view is only one aspect of the cataclysm, because it would all depend on where you live. You would have, as I said before, it was the Younger D impact that is the source of the Noahic flood. Then you would have all sorts of calamitous things unfolding on the earth. If you lived in the impact zone, then you're vaporized if you lie underneath those sheets of ice. In other words, if you live further south, then you're going to be washed away by tidal waves from all that rushing down to the ocean. If you live in a heavily forested area, that is affected by the ejecta, this molten ejecta from the impact, then you're going to be concealed live fires. If you near fires in the semi-massive wildfire fallings, you're going to experience devastating earthquakes. So everybody is experiencing the cataclysm. If you live in a coastal region on a river or lake, you're going to be underwater. You know, if you're living in close proximity to the ocean or a river, you're going to be underwater, right? So that's why I call it a global cataclysm, and most people just think in terms of a flood. I'm thinking about something much more dynamic and destructive than just water, and I believe every continent was experiencing catastrophic flooding, but not necessarily that every square inch of ground was under the water. Again, and people are going to immediately protest and say, but doesn't the Bible say X, Y, and Z? My answer is there are plenty of scholars who make good hermeneutical argument for a local flood using the same words in Hebrew and with a very logical position on what those words are conveying. I would say just as convincing anyone making an argument for the global flood. And that's important to keep in mind, just because you haven't been exposed to that scholarship doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And a lot of people get very angry about this because they assume that there's only one way to interpret certain texts and certain events. It's just not true. It's just not true. And again, there's a lot of good scholarship arguing for a local flood. And if a local flood is possible, then a global cataclysm is possible. So those are the three options. And there may be more. You have the global flood every square inch underwater. You have a local flood, a localized catastrophic flooding event. And then you have a global cataclysm. Every square inch of the earth is affected by a catalyst, but indifferent now. In the global flood scenario, you only have a possibility for survival on the ark unless you're a fish, right? So all of the land creatures would be drowned except for those that are on the ark in a local flood scenario. Then you have the profusion of life on earth, most of it being unaffected, and only that region, that particular region, being catastrophically affected by that cataclysm, by the flood, still saving those individuals who are on the ark because that's where they were living and still being delivered through that flood in the manner that the Bible describes. And if you, in the same way, if you have a global catalyst, then you have opportunity for survival as well outside of the ark. And again, everyone always immediately accuses me and others of denying the plain reading of the scriptures. It's just not. So that's not the case. You are reading an English interpret. You're reading an English translation of a particular interpretation. It's not the only interpretation in regard to the flood. And so it's simply, and when people get up in arms about this, just a manifestation of ignorance. So I personally lean toward a global cataclysm. However, I'm perfectly willing to accept a global flood or a local flood. I'm open to all three possibilities. All three propositions are on the table. But I lean in the direction of a global cataclysm, so you can see now, depending on which of these options you choose, will bear upon regarding how the Nephilim made it through the flood into the post-Diluvian world, into the post-flood world now. If you subscribe to global flood, then you're really limited. The Nephilim would have had to do one of two things. They would have to have some extraordinary way of surviving, like going underground. Maybe the other option, which is probably, perhaps, I would say, at the least equally plausible, is that the genes of the giant giants and the DNA of the giants were carried through the flood in the genomes of Noah's wives, or one of them, specifically Ham's wife, probably based on what unfolds at the flood. And so that's a popular theory, that genetic stock, so to speak, that DNA information of the Nephilim came through the flood, literally carried in the genome of, let's say, Ham's wife. Right, that's possible. I'm certainly open to that idea. Okay, so if you subscribe to a local flood, then the question is moved, because if you weren't inhabiting that specific area that was flooded, then you would not have been eliminated, annihilated. And the same can be said of the global catalysm hypothesis. So take your pick, or there may be other options. Now, one option that I reject, the Nova second incursion, it's often referred to as the second incursion, and this is the second incursion, proposes air music that had happened again in Genesis 6 type transgression, that the Genesis 6 of fear happened again. So it seems like a very simple explanation for a lot of people. How do we get giants in the post-flood world? Angels did it again, came down, they copulated with human women, and the same thing happened. I don't think so. So why don't I think so? Because the first event is so well attested, instrumental, so fundamental to Hebrew cosmology, that it's unthinkable that the second incursion would be undocumented and nowhere mentioned. Anywhere. There is no mention of a second incursion anywhere, and the first one is so well documented. It's so important in the minds of the ancient Hebrews to think that a second incursion would just be no big deal is ludicrous in my mind. So, and also the judgment on the Watchers was so severe and apparent to the rest of the angels that I think it was an effective deterrent. So I do not believe in a second incursion. There is no evidence.